Now, that is the last of our musical clips, so we can now actually start to stream the rest of this presentation, because I don't want to talk about reggae music. I want to talk about what reggae gave culture, how it helped to change the world for all of us, whether we listen to or even like reggae music. None of this actually has anything to do with the musical style. It's to do with the people that created that musical style. And the first one is the mobile disco. If you've been to a wedding, if you've been to a place like this and a DJ has turned up in a van, the reason why they've turned up in a van is because somebody got this idea of going round from place to place and playing their music, especially where there were no venues or venues where they weren't allowed. And the people that started to invent that were the people that were playing reggae on reggae sound systems. So we go from this to this, because of course there was a massive diaspora, an influx of Jamaicans in the 50s and then in the 60s. So in this country, anything that was created and invented and developed in Jamaica that was then brought over here became part of the Anglo-Jamaican culture, and then started to become part of the musical subculture or the subculture, and then became part of our culture. So it's a direct line to the person playing Last Christmas at the disco at the end of the Christmas meal at a works outing on the upstairs of a restaurant, and somebody in 1965 saying, well, actually, if we just take our equipment and put it in a shed or a barn, we can put a show on there. I think we also tend to think that the influence of Jamaican music, because there's ska and rocksteady and dancehall and things like that, we tend to think that that is something that has only influenced British culture and English culture, but that's not true, because I said it's a diaspora. It's a people that are spreading out through certain parts of the world. Bob Marley spent a few years working in a Chrysler plant in America. Jamaicans did go to America and brought some of their culture. There's a tradition in Jamaican music of taking a backing track and toasting over the top of it and doing something that is halfway between singing and talking, or dare I say poetry. There's a good reason for that. What was happening was there was a massive demand for these tracks to go out to the dance halls and to the places where the guys were producing their mobile discos or their mobile sound systems. So what some producers were doing was, if the singer didn't turn up and they wanted to get the track out, they just put it out. So they put it out as an instrumental, and then the people that were spinning the discs on the turntables and were obviously using a mic to announce the tracks, then started to toast over the top of it. So that very idea of using your voice not as a singer but over instrumental tracks became something that went to America. In America, they didn't have that tradition of all these instrumental tracks being brought out, which is why you then start to get using turntables, where what you do is you find an instrumental break, get two turntables, get two records. You should have two turntables anyway. And what you do is, if it's like an 8-bar break, you play those 8 bars on one record and have the other one lined up with that same 8-bar break. Play the 8-bar break on the second record. While that's playing, you spin the first record back to the beginning of the 8-bar break, and that's how you get that instrumental track to do that. So they had to create their own version because they didn't have the musical material. I know he says illegal rave scene, but I like to think that it was just that the police didn't approve or society didn't approve. I went to a few illegal raves, and they were the most mild-mannered and supportive places you can imagine, especially in the early days. They were taking the same issues and dealing with them the same way that Jamaican immigrants were dealing with them. So they didn't necessarily have clubs that they could go to or that would put on Jamaican music, or venues. So what they did was they just put the shows on wherever they could, which means that you then have somewhere set up. But if you're going to put on a party, there are things that go with a party. So there is putting on drink, putting on the sound system. So one of the things that would happen is house parties. So on a weekend, you want to earn some money, you put on some food, get some drink and sell that, put on a sound system, put on an event, put on a party. It's not approved by the police and maybe will get broken up. In some ways, it used to get more and more formalised. I only went to one blues, as it was known, in Sheffield. And I expected, because it was a highly illegal Jamaican drinking den, I expected that it was, I don't know what I expected, but what I didn't expect to do was walk in and find slot machines and a bar selling draft beer, and it'd just be like a normal pub that only opened when the pubs were closed. So it opened in the afternoon when the pubs closed in the afternoons in the old days, and it opened again at 10:30 in the evening after all the pubs closed. And it was just an illegal bar for Jamaicans because that was the tradition. So all of that rave scene where you want to put on dance music, but none of the clubs want to put it on, none of the discos that they still had then in the late 80s still, you put it on in a warehouse. And of course, because you're doing something that is on your own volition, the police and the society don't approve. And yes, there are drugs involved as well. There's like stay up all night drugs for the rave scene, and there's cannabis and weed for the Jamaican scene. So there is that, but really it is just as much that people are doing it for themselves and you don't have a license to do it in both senses as it is to do with the fact that it is illegal and that there are drugs involved. You know, we make it illegal by saying it's illegal. Proper sound systems and quite sophisticated sound systems, especially when you want to push some air. Reggae is very bass heavy. Little tinny speaker systems are not going to push it. The Beatles played Shea Stadium with 30-watt amplifiers. What is famous for it is you probably couldn't hear them if you were standing at the front of the stage listening. I don't think they could actually hear themselves on stage. Sound systems did start to get better because of rock music, but to get really properly balanced sound systems that everybody was using, not just Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Yes and all the big rock bands. It was again Jamaican music that did that because they needed it. They needed to produce bass heavy music. They needed big sound systems. And if you look on this here, this sound system here is going from the stage to the top of the scaffolding. So you've got just a massive stack of speakers on either side. And that idea that instead of someone standing on the stage with as many guitar amps as they can, trying to make it as loud as possible, and it would be competing with the other guitarist, and I don't know how you're supposed to hear the drums or the singing, and it's just this kind of hodgepodge of equipment and a kind of free-for-all trying to get the sound balanced, where the musicians are trying to get the sound as loud as they can for their instrument. The people at the front don't have a lot of control. That changed to what we've got now, which is the sound people have got all the equipment they need and all of the power they need to control all of the sound system, or all of the sound. That only happens with a big enough sound system. So until somebody comes along and says, how big can we make our sound system, and starts to drive that, without that you don't get this. Yeah. And bass heavy music, that very idea where bass is important, and it did get more and more important, and it still is now. How much bass can you put through the speakers? Because reggae music is driven by the bass. The interview I did with Tony, like 5 seconds talking about the guitar. You just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Quite a lot talking about the bass and how the bass fits in, and how it's not just what you play, but what you don't play. And the fact that he can then remember the bass line to Three Little Birds because it's such a cool bass line. Once bass becomes important because it is what actually drives the rhythm and the melody, guitarists aren't as important. You need bass speakers. You need to push the bass. I've been to reggae nights where the bass is so heavy, when it hits the low notes, my vision blurs. And drinks moving across the table is quite common, but literally I'm standing there when he goes boom and hits the low note. I literally have blurred vision because it's vibrating in my head. Not as much these days, so I don't think I can take it. So the idea of pushing bass music in the dance scene, he got to the point where one of my friends runs a PA company, and in a month they burnt out his speaker drivers 3 times because they were pushing and pushing the bass on the tracks they were recording at home, or the DJs that were the producers that were producing the music. And of course, a small fraction of that bass power was actually coming through their headphones or the little speakers in their house. They take it and put it out on a full frequency sound system, and the speakers were getting pushed so hard it was blowing the speakers. He had to put a limiter across everything because it was the only way he was going to save his sound. It was like literally every other night that he hired out the equipment, he was getting blown. And the remix came from dub music. That idea that we had in the past that we talked about, where people were putting out tracks that were unfinished, that was perfect because then people could start messing around with them. So the DJs were increasing the bass and then decreasing the bass, pushing the mid frequencies, trying to play with the sound, then starting to finding echo boxes and reverb boxes, and adding echo and adding reverb to the sounds that were going on. That then has a backwash. So the producers in the studios start adding reverb, start adding echo, start messing around with the frequencies, start messing around with adding extra sound effects. Then they start producing dub versions of tracks. So there's a normal track that's being produced, really popular. So they go back to that original, take out the vocals and start adding effects to it and put it out as a dub version. To the point where sometimes you get an entire album that was just dub versions of the same song. And you get big producers like Lee Scratch Perry, who died, a month ago. He was a genius in the way that only pretty crazy people can be a genius. One of his tracks involves him going out to the back of his studio with a microphone and opening and closing the tap and recording the water hitting the pavement in time to the music on a set of headphones, and then putting that into his mix, playing a comb and paper and stuff like that. So whenever you see remix versions, which remix culture was massive, so much, we don't talk about it as much now, but it is it's like the air. It just happens all the time. People are still bringing out remix albums. People are still bringing out 3 or 4 versions of the same track. Not just cutting out the swearing, but actually bringing out different versions or getting different producers to produce different versions of the track. That all goes back to people like Lee Scratch Perry responding to what people wanted in the clubs. What people wanted in the clubs was music where the music was doing interesting things, and we're getting less interested in the lyrics all the time, or just the lyrics. Oh, and dreadlocks. Some people say that dreadlocks aren't just Jamaican, that I think Celts wore dreadlocks as well. I'm not sure about dreadlocks and cultural appropriation and things like that, but it's something we've got to we accept, is that it becomes a multicultural feature, a multicultural asset that we've got. I don't know where I stand on that. Those of my friends used to have dreads. The idea that we're being racist now for wearing dreads I find really difficult, but I also am acutely aware all the time that you can be just taking other people's culture and putting nothing back and bringing nothing to the party. Enough of the dreaded vegans. Rock against racism. Having talked about cultural appropriation and saying that there's a thing about, playing reggae music when you're white, and that first track that we listened to, not the first track, the first bit of music that we listened to during that interview with a band called the Scatterlights, they're all young white kids playing ska music, occasionally with a black singer. There's the worry that it is cultural appropriation, but in the 70s, at the very forefront of rock against racism, wasn't rock musicians. Certainly wasn't with people like Eric Clapton standing up and basically doing like quasi-National Front propaganda speeches in 1978. A lot of that rock against racism, a lot of the groups that were at the forefront of that were reggae bands and ska bands and multi-ethnic bands and multicultural bands. And let's not forget, and you can see here, skinheads were not, the skinhead culture was not a racist culture. When it started, it was a show of unity with black working class kids, or white working class kids, and their music of choice was reggae. And that changed to it being, skinheads being associated with the National Front and the far right was something that happened after quite a few years of reggae. So, if anything, it's an example of where we can create a multicultural multicultural music and a multicultural musical culture. Because from the 70s, the 80s, it was one of the few examples of black culture that was shared with white culture, where there were multicultural bands. And it wasn't just multiracial, also it was across the genders as well. Very few bands at the time had women that were genuinely part of the band that weren't just singers. The places where that happened, that was in two-tone, and that was in ska bands, and that was in reggae bands. And a lot of those people that started off there are still now really significant cultural icons as well, not just from being singers, but by becoming writers and things like that. So, this may play me out on my favourite track. We shall see. And if it does, it's going to play Grammarly. We'll cut this bit out. So thank you and good night.